In this lesson, we are going to be talking about how to get a professional mix by using tomatoes. Specifically, we're really talking about why small incremental steps are actually the best way to get a professional mix. We're going to be using tomatoes as the illustration for why that actually is the case. So let's talk about tomatoes. If you've never gardened before or done starters for your garden, if you have gardened before, there's this kind of interesting thing that happens with tomatoes when you're starting tomatoes indoors. You end up with a little sprout that looks somewhat like this. They've got two big leaves. So here's the soil. And here's essentially what the goal, right? We want to get really tall tomato plants. And so our tomato plant obviously has a long ways to go to reach that ultimate goal. But what happens is if you don't have enough light, then what happens is the tomato plant grows really, really fast, but it still has a really skinny trunk, essentially. And then ultimately, it just falls over because it can't actually support itself, and that snaps, something like that, right? Because it tries to grow so fast towards the sun to get enough sunlight that it eventually just outgrows its support system and then just falls apart, breaks, dies, and then you ultimately end up with no delicious tomatoes at the end of the day. So that is opposed to the proper way to grow tomatoes. So if there's our soil, right, we start off with our little seedling there. If we prevent it from growing so fast, it tries to grow to here, but we actually take a pair of scissors, knock it off there, prevent it from growing. What that does is that it forces energy down and into the roots. Bloop, 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 bloop. And ultimately, then it actually gets the nutrients it needs, and then it actually thickens up this stem right here, so that when it actually grows into a big old tomato plant with lots of leaves, it can actually grow nice, healthy tomatoes. This is a tomato plant, just pretend. And ultimately, it does reach the goal of becoming big because it has nice, thick stems all the way through the whole plant. Thick stems, why we need to allow it to grow slowly to then eventually reach the goal of big maturity in the tomato plant, so then it can actually bear some fruit. Same thing with our mixes. Our mixes, if you try to grow too fast and you try to make really big changes right off the bat inside of your mixes, you're gonna end up with the spindly little leaf that eventually, cracks throughout the middle and falls down and dies because you tried to grow too fast, too soon, and ultimately you'll ruin your mix because you won't have any of that initial support, that foundation set in stone before you actually continue on with the rest of the mix. So you're trying to do mastering type activities essentially before you've even properly EQ'd your vocal, for example, right? And it's not about necessarily thinking about doing other processes, but you're listening to, say, a reference song that has a mastered vocal, and you're thinking about your vocal, and you're like, well, I need to make it sound like that, even though there's 7 or 8 steps before that point of my actual mastered song that has the mastered vocal in it versus my vocal. And so I think I need to make the 8-step, process happen all in this one single step, which, again, as we've talked about, always will result in this type of scenario and not this type of scenario. So we need to ensure that we're actually holding back at the beginning of our mix and not making dramatic moves. Because if I'm gonna be boosting my electric guitars by 9 decibels at 3 kilohertz, even though it initially sounds better to me because I'm boosting so much and it feels like it needs more there, by the end of the mix, it's just overly harsh and aggressive, and there's not enough meat in the guitar because I ruined it from the very beginning. I tried to grow too fast, and ultimately I died. Or my mix died, I should say, not me. That's the whole concept of mixing with small, tiny incremental changes. Because if we allow it to progress at its own pace, and go through the process at the proper pace, then ultimately we'll end up with a much stronger and healthier mix at the end of the day, rather than this spindly little thing that, it's closer than here, right? Same amount of time passed, but ultimately this one can mature and reach our ultimate goal versus this one it's never going to, because it's gonna fall over and die in the wind when anything, you know, brushes against it. It's just gonna, All right, so I hope this was helpful. We're gonna be covering our rule of 3 next, and it's gonna be super powerful in unlocking some of this potential and this kind of thought process of how to actually incrementally change stuff. And then we're gonna be diving into the mix as well. We're gonna get into the DAW here very soon, so stick with me, and I'll see you in the next one.